Welcome back to the B'nai B'rith Leadership Forum. I'm Eric Fusfield, Director of Legislative Affairs and Deputy Director of the B'nai B'rith International Center for Human Rights and Public Policy. We're turning now to a discussion about the US elections and their impact on Jewish concerns. This is a moment to underscore that B'nai B'rith is a nonpartisan tax-exempt organization. We have no rooting interest in the outcome of elections, but we remain focused on our public policy priorities, regardless of who wins. In this case, Joe Biden appears to be the winner of the presidential election, although President Trump is challenging the results. But I understand this morning there was a tweet coming from his account that at least conditionally acknowledges a Biden win, so we'll stay tuned. But despite losing the White House, Republicans gained seats in the House of Representatives and are on track to maintain control of the Senate. Two runoff elections in Georgia remain. Republicans are favored to hold on to those seats, but we won't know till January. We have many international viewers today, so I should note that while the world has been focused on the outcome of the presidential election, what kind of landscape President-elect Biden will face when he takes office will be very much impacted by congressional races that have already taken place and that still await us in Georgia. With so much to unpack, we're very fortunate to have with us today two of the top political writers in the business who also have their fingers on the pulse of our own community and the issues we follow. Lisa Lerer is a reporter for the New York Times, where she covers elections in the political scene. Josh Kraushaar is a political editor and columnist for the National Journal. These are folks whose articles you probably read. You've also seen them commenting on TV news, particularly during the recent election cycle. And perhaps you've heard them on radio or podcasts as well. Today, we're pleased to have them with us at the Leadership Forum. Lisa and Josh, welcome to you both. I'd like to start with the broad picture before homing in on what this all means for the Jewish community. Assuming the results hold, this was the rare case in which an incumbent president was voted out of office after one term, and yet Republicans made gains in Congress. If it's tempting to think of this kind of election as a referendum on the incumbent, what's the real verdict when Trump lost but still seemed to have coattails? Lisa, would you like to handle this? I see that you're still muted, so if you'll unmute first and then let us know. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Hi, thanks for having me. I mean, look, I think the verdict may not be that surprising. This was not, as you point out, a broad denunciation of President Trump, nor was it, I think, a particularly broad mandate for Biden. I think the end result of this is that we're still a very divided country, as we have been throughout the entire Trump administration. If you look at the candidates, both candidates got more votes than any other presidential candidate in history. Biden got more than President Trump, of course, but the turnout was astronomical. Some of our normal political alliances were scrambled to get a bit, but as you said, what we ended up with is looking like it will probably be divided government. Republicans made gains in the House, surprising many Democrats and even some Republicans who expected Democrats to expand their margin there. In the Senate, it's really tight. Control of the Senate is going to rest on these two runoff races in Georgia that'll be happening in early January. The odds seem to be with Republicans. If you look at the history of runoffs in that state, Democrats would have to win both of those Senate seats, and even then, it would be a split with incoming Vice President Harris as the tie-breaking vote. So this is not a broad mandate for either party. What we're looking at here is 4 more years of divided government.
Josh, what do you think? The American people seem to like divided government.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. There's sort of a paradox with the election results because you had a clear majority of voters. Looks like Joe Biden is on track for about a 5-point lead or win when all the votes are counted. So, I mean, a clear majority of voters wanted to vote out President Trump. But I think it's also fair when, as Lisa said, when you look at the down ballot results, the Senate likely to stay in Republican hands, and the House Republicans making some surprising gains. They were uncomfortable with the broader Democratic agenda, or maybe perhaps more precisely, there wasn't really a Democratic agenda being articulated by Joe Biden. He was, predominantly running a campaign on a return to normalcy, on sort of taking Trump out of office, and the vacuum on policy was almost left for some of the more progressive voices within the Democratic Party. And I think when you look at the down ballot results, there were some, moderate-minded suburban districts where Trump was not popular, but ultimately these voters cast their ballots for Republicans and for Joe Biden. But you've got this polarized electorate, about as little split ticket voting as we've ever seen in recent history. And the only times when you really saw that split ticket voting was when you had an incumbent who had a real defined record of bipartisanship. Susan Collins is probably the most prominent lawmaker who comes to mind that fits that profile. But there were some other House members who also were well-known veterans who had a good record of working across the aisle, and they were able to outrun the top of the ticket. Or you also saw some races where the challenger, usually Democratic challengers in this election, were seen as too progressive, too extreme, supported Medicare for all, endorsed Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren in the primary. Those candidates who were running in battleground districts and swing districts saw a pretty significant penalty from these swing voters, even as we've seen this increased tribalism, partisanship in our politics. So, I mean, I guess I'd close with just as looking at the top line analysis. We're in the middle, maybe at the end stage of something of a realignment, broadly speaking. When you look back over the last 4 years, Democrats have now consolidated the urban and the upscale suburban vote. Trump, it depends on what exit poll you look at, and the data is still a little bit noisy. But clearly, no matter what poll you look at, whether it was the Edison exit poll or the Fox exit poll, Trump had an all-time low performance among suburban voters. You have to go back to 1964 to see a worse Republican performance in the suburbs. So that's a reality. Republican voters did end up becoming Biden voters by significant numbers, or at least becoming Democrats over the last few years. But also working class whites are now becoming Republican. And these used to be swing voters. Obama in the Midwest performed very well with white voters in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But even though Biden may have made some small inroads in certain communities, the overall trend is unmistakable that the traditional heart of the LBJ FDR coalition, the working class white voters, are now becoming more or less party line Republicans. And that's something that's really on the minds of a lot of Democrats right now. And how do they win some of those voters back going forward? So that's the top line. There's a lot more to discuss, but it was a pretty momentous election.
Yeah, I want to get back to that progressive agenda you referenced a moment ago. So as Lisa said, if the Republicans hang on in Georgia, we're going to continue to have divided government, at least for the next 2 years. But we could say that both parties are at a crossroads right now. The Democrats will take over the White House, but what kind of Democratic Party will we see? For President-elect Biden, the job of placating his party's progressive wing will presumably be even more difficult for him if the Democrats do take back the Senate. So he might see that outcome as a mixed blessing, wouldn't he? What do you think about that, Josh?
Well, there are two ways you can look at it. Divided government can lead to gridlock, and you laid out one of them. I mean, I'll lay out the gridlock scenario, and I'll lay out the bipartisan scenario. I mean, the gridlock scenario is pretty clear that you have divided government, that a lot of Democrats don't view Mitch McConnell as a legitimate partner, as someone who actually wants to work and compromise. And furthermore, he doesn't have a lot of lawmakers in his caucus that are ultimately going to want to work with a Biden administration. And I think even more significantly that you have The House, which is the Pelosi's majority is going to be much narrower, and she lost some of her moderate members, and she's going to be having a similar time to what John Boehner and Paul Ryan had to deal with a narrower majority where the most ideological members really can screw things up and make it harder to cut deals. And you also have a pretty a growing number of both parties' caucuses are dominated by the more ideological factions of their parties. So you can see the formula for gridlock. I wrote a column because I think people are underestimating the opportunities for bipartisanship given this alignment. Of course, you have to wait to see what happens in these two Georgia Senate runoffs. But assuming McConnell does have a very narrow majority going forward, he has a handful of lawmakers in that Senate caucus that don't want gridlock. Mitt Romney, Susan Collins, Rob Portman, folks who have their own political incentives to compromise across the aisle. Biden's inheriting a scenario where there's actually going to be a lot of non-ideological agenda items, things that shouldn't, maybe they will be because everything's partisan these days, but certainly, getting COVID relief passed if this doesn't happen in the lame duck, dealing with healthcare, dealing with an economic stimulus. These are things that could be partisan footballs, but they're among the least ideological issues that you could possibly imagine for a president to deal with in his honeymoon period. So I don't think there's a lot of political incentives for Republicans to just be obstructionists, because ultimately their voters also want help. They also want aid. They're struggling as well, and there is room, at least at the beginning, for some compromise. And I'd also add that even though you do have a larger percentage of ideologues within both caucuses, Republicans actually got an infusion of pragmatism, of some more moderates in their caucus. When you look at the results, not a whole lot, but they're about, they doubled the number of women in their caucus. But I think more importantly, they won some of the Biden and Clinton districts. They elected 2 Korean American lawmakers or executives from Orange County, California, which is a very purple area now, very competitive. They elected, a lot. If you look at some of the freshman class lawmakers, many of them are not from the kind of nihilistic wing, as I might call it, in the Republican Party, and their political incentives are to be a little more pragmatic. So while the Democrats lost a few of their moderates, Republicans gained a little bit more moderation, even though you hear a lot about some of the more extreme lawmakers. The ones who don't get as much attention but can also make a big difference in a narrowly divided House are some of the moderates, the folks who don't generally get as much publicity. So, I do see an opportunity, and I think most importantly, frankly, Joe Biden is not Donald Trump. He's not Barack Obama. He is someone who is a creature of the Senate, is a creature of Washington, is someone who ran a campaign predominantly on trying to work across the aisle, insisting that there is a different way to go forward and do things in a more bipartisan way. And the president in our system does have a lot of power in setting the agenda for his party and really defining kind of the mood in Washington. So, I don't think he has any illusions that we're in a different time than when he was last in the Senate, but he is inheriting a political landscape that actually is quite favorable for bipartisanship.
I think the victories by women and minorities on the Republican side is actually one of the more undertold stories about this election. Lisa, what do you think? Would a narrow Republican majority in the Senate open up new doors for bipartisanship, as Josh is saying? And is this what Joe Biden might be secretly crossing his fingers and hoping for?
So I think Josh is entirely more optimistic than I am, I have to say. And I think his analysis, of course, as always, is spot on. But there was one, giant factor that's sitting in the White House right now that he's leaving out, which is President Trump, right? And if you look at what's happened in the past week, since the election really was called last Saturday, you see that, yes, a few Republicans have come out and said that they're recognizing Joe Biden as the winner of this election, which, like, he is. Despite these lawsuits, there's no evidence of massive vote fraud or anything like that on a scale that would change the outcome of this race. But for the most part, right, Republicans have stuck with the president on refusing to recognize Biden as the president-elect. And so why is that happening? Well, that's happening because Republicans recognize the political dynamics as they have for the past 4 years in their own party, which is that President Trump holds a very strong, a lot of power and has a lot of support among the Republican base. And we saw that he brought out new Republican voters, this time around. Like his hold on the party in some ways has grown over the past 4 years. So I think as long as he remains a player in the system and a player as someone with clout, which, by all indications he intends to do, and as long as there's this jockeying, which there has started already to be the heir to sort of to Trumpism in the 2024 presidential race, I think you're going to see that it becomes hard for Republicans to cut bipartisan deals, because doing so will mean crossing a base that's still deeply tied to President Trump. Now, does that mean that Joe Biden can't break off a couple members of the Senate? He may be able to, and he may, in fact, as Josh pointed out, be able to get some of the lower hanging fruit things done, like COVID relief, which has been, held up for weeks and weeks and weeks, but should not be something that is hard to pass in the middle of an unprecedented pandemic in a country facing a pretty potentially dire economic situation. So something like that could happen. But as for the bigger ticket items that he's indicated he wants to tackle, like healthcare, even something potentially like criminal justice reform or infrastructure, I think it may be harder depending how the politics play out with President Trump. I just don't think, we have no reason to expect that President Trump is going to be like any of, following the tradition of previous presidents and sort of accept the results and decline to criticize his successor and things like that. I don't think anyone expects that. So as long as he still has a hold on the party and there still are people jockeying to take over his base, I think it's going to make the politics much harder than Biden would like. Now, as for whether he wants a divided Senate, I'm sure we know that Joe Biden would love to have a majority in the Senate. Of course, having a Democratic in the majority of the Senate would make it much easier for him, even as he would have to navigate the political cross currents in his own party. At least there would be momentum sort of within the party to get things done, and he wouldn't have to be getting Republicans to break with potentially the base of their own party, which it could be what ends up happening. I think it may be pretty tough for Biden to get things through Congress once he gets past sort of the easier things where there may be more bipartisan consensus. But I do think he's probably better positioned than any of the other Democrats who ran in that massive Democratic primary, which I'm sure we all still remember, to cross party lines, because he has such a long history in Washington. He understands the Senate. He has personal relationships with people like Susan Collins, other people in the Senate. The big question here will be, how much is today's Washington different from the Washington that Joe Biden was a senator in 2007? And I think it is fairly different. The Senate has grown more ideological on both sides of the aisle. It's much harder for them to pass big things through Congress. So the question will be how Biden is able to use his sort of skills of the old Washington in the new Washington. And we're just going to have to see how all that plays out.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I want to continue on this thread that you've started about the role of Trump himself, the giant factor still sitting in the White House, as you said, and then Trumpism, his populist brand, because that's not necessarily going away. And as you said, a lot of Republicans may still be beholden to that brand of Republican politics. I mean, he's still the dominant figure of his party. He's the alpha male, the one who can draw the big crowds like nobody else can. I want to ask it this way. How tight a grip will he out of the White House, out of office, how tight a grip will he continue to hold on this party? And what are we going to see from Trump himself? Is he going to be a kind of aggrieved shadow president who will spend the next 4 years talking about the election that he feels is stolen from him, and what does that mean for 2024 in your view?
Well, look, I mean, if I've learned one thing in the past 4 years, it is not to predict what Donald Trump is going to do. So I am out of that game, guys. But we can talk about some of the things that we've been hearing from the people around him and from the president himself, which is that, there's speculation that he might want to start his own news network. He's mad at Fox. He wants to start something to compete with Fox. I think it's pretty hard to start a news network. And we've seen, politicians like Sarah Palin try to do that in the past, and it falls fairly flat because media is a tough business. But, he could start something like that and maybe get a foothold. There's been speculation that he already wants to run again in 2024, which would effectively freeze this pretty large field of Republicans who have already begun jockeying to be his replacement. It certainly does not seem like, as of now, he has any intention of fading quietly away. And based on everything we know about the president and we've seen from the president the past 4 years, it feels to me like that would be a highly unlikely outcome. But he also has a bunch of lawsuits that are pending in various courts about his businesses that could complicate the dynamics for him. So as for what the future of President Trump himself holds, a lot of speculation, but frankly, we don't really know. But as for Trumpism, which is how he has reshaped the Republican Party, that is not going away. And the idea that the Republican Party, I think, would return to the party of like the Bushes or even Romney just feels a little far-fetched to me. I just don't see that happening because Trump has changed the base. When you look at public opinion polling on issues like trade, or things like that were sort of major parts of the Republican Party platform, the Republican Party base has changed because Trump has changed the party in his own image. So I think we're going to see Republicans, there's certainly a wing of the Republican Party that wants them to become more populist, take a more aggressive position towards things like big technology companies or even college endowments, making the price of college cheaper, not in sort of the path Bernie Sanders would pursue, but maybe in a different path to go after what they see as the elitism in American society, which definitely are major strains of Trumpism. So I think, as Josh pointed out, at the top of this, we have seen a pretty interesting political realignment in this election where you have working class white voters, generally, high school educated voters that have shifted from the Democratic Party, where they were the base for a long time, to Republicanism. And that's going to change how Republicans move forward. So President Trump, I don't think he's going away. What he does is, anyone's guess. I'm not sure he even knows. But Trumpism, I think, is here to stay and will be a major factor reshaping the Republican Party, as we look towards certainly the midterm election, but probably the presidential primary in 2024 as well.
Josh, would you agree that Trumpism is with us to stay for the time being? And do you have any prognostications about what we might see from Trump himself over the next few years?
Well, I agree with almost everything Lisa said, that there's, especially on the Trumpism side of things. But the question is, how do you define Trumpism, right? I mean, you ask 10 different Republicans and they have a different view of what Trump stands for. Is it nationalism? Is it trade, immigration, just owning the liberals? Like, well, what does Trumpism mean? To me, a lot of the Trump vote, from my reporting and just looking at the data, suggests that some of it is negative polarization. Some of it is, I don't love Trump's personal behavior, but boy, he owns. When he talks about cancel culture, I'm with him. I hate that even more. So there is some of that. The owning the libs, political incorrectness type of appeal that Trump has, that I don't know if it's translatable as much to other Republicans. One of the more interesting questions in the exit poll was when voters were asked whether if Biden won the election, would they be more disappointed or angry? And you actually saw an even 50% divide between people who would be disappointed and people who would be angry if Biden won. And you saw the 50% in Washington yesterday at the MAGA march, but there is this unstable coalition that both parties are dealing with. But you can see it on the Republican side pretty clearly, where you've got the Trumpism, the Trumpist side of the party, which is much more populist, depends on support from these new voters, working class, blue collar voters. But you still have the old school, traditional conservatives that Mitch McConnell represents. Appointing judges, tax cuts, the donors that give to the Republican Party aren't exactly Trumpists. So Republicans are dealing with this weird, unstable coalition between the establishment, if you will, and the Trumpists. And the Democrats are dealing with a pretty unstable coalition of progressives and more pragmatists, the more suburban voters that have come into the party. So we're in a very volatile time in our politics. I mean, the $64,000 question, as Lisa, really made all the right points on. What does Trump do out of office, and does being in power dramatically change his hold with the base in a way that not having power will?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sort of in. I mean, I don't have anyone who knows Trump's psychology knows how unpredictable he is, and anyone making any firm prediction is going to be off base. But I think it is fair to say that once he doesn't have power, I mean, a lot of these Republicans are kind of humoring him because they want to win either the Georgia Senate runoff coming up in a month, and they don't want to split the party before then, or they have things that they want to accomplish, like perhaps Lindsey Graham is sucking up to Trump because he doesn't want him to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, from Iraq in the final 2 months of his administration. So there is some realpolitik that's taking place with some of these Republicans because he's still in power. He can still do things that may be against their own personal interests. So there's no doubt Trump is still going to have a hold on his base. I think it's kind of like, anyone who watched The Apprentice, it's the difference between The Apprentice season 2 and The Celebrity Apprentice that came out, when the ratings were going down and only the diehards were watching that show. He's going to have a hold on a decent segment of the party. The question is, what is that percentage? I think it's very possible that's under half the party. In fact, I think the exit poll suggests that it's about a 50-50 split right now between the Trumpists and the establishment. And I also think that Biden, if he's successful as president, if he's skillful and pick off, can divide, the parties that are divided are the ones that end up losing these political fights. So if Biden is able to introduce legislation that it's hard for the Republican lawmakers in the Senate to oppose, especially on some of this non-ideological stuff, he could really, gain the upper hand politically. I think the president just dominates Washington in terms of who has the upper hand politically. And if Biden is, adroit in kind of picking issues that can have bipartisan appeal, I think he could put a lot of pressure on that 50% of the Republican coalition that's more traditional, that isn't quite as enamored with the president himself.
Okay, good. Well, I think we've got a really good foundation here. So I want to turn to the Jewish angle in all of this. The question of how American Jews voted this year depends on whom you ask. But clearly more Jews than not remain loyal to the Democratic Party, with an Associated Press survey finding that 68% of Jews voted for Biden and 30% for Trump. President Trump has delivered on a number of initiatives that even some Jews who didn't vote for him support, like recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital or new sanctions on Iran. It remains to be seen how President-elect Biden will shift course or not on these and other issues. But what has this election taught us about Jewish expectations and Jewish priorities in 2020? Josh, you want to go first?
Well, I'll start off with the politics. And I will say, maybe I'll say at the outset, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of significant change, frankly, because Biden, his record suggests he's got a pretty traditional pro-Israel record. He's talked about, getting back into the Iran nuclear deal, but with the news over the last week about Iran harboring, the Al-Qaeda number 2, that's going to be hard to just, make kumbaya with Iran, given the realities on the ground. So, I think Biden is from the wing of the Democratic Party that really, is in sync with the broad constituency in the Jewish community. As far as the politics go within the Jewish community, we all always talk a lot about like the religion and religiosity really being one of the big political divides. That if I can tell you how many times you go to services a week or a month, that is almost as good a predictor as any in figuring out who you voted for in the last election. And for the Jewish community, that wasn't always the case. Most Jews voted Democrat, but there wasn't a huge denominational split until more recently, maybe in the last 8 to 10 years. And now there is a significant partisan split based on Jewish denomination. That we're still looking at the data. There are exit polls that you referenced, Eric, and you can also look at some of the key House races and precinct by precinct data. But there's a lot of evidence that more Orthodox voters swung pretty dramatically to Trump in this election. You look at Florida, the Fox AP poll showed about 40% of Jews voted for Trump, which is a big jump from previous elections. And you look at certain precincts where you have a high concentration of either modern Orthodox or more Haredi Orthodox voters, and there was a clear swing towards the Republicans and to President Trump. So you are seeing, we're talking about polarization, tribalism. We were even seeing within communities, right? We're seeing communities that were once united, perhaps more united on the broader politics, are now seeing the tribalism even seep internally, and certainly the religiosity is one of the best sort of differentiators across the board, but also within the Jewish community and how someone viewed this presidential election.
Lisa, any thoughts about what we know about where the Jewish community is politically at this moment in time?
Yeah, I think Josh hit it exactly right. There's a clear correlation between observance and partisanship. And I mean, if you look at the parts of the community that are growing in terms of people who are at all observant, which is really not the majority of American Jews, right? If you look at the surveys, it is Reform and Orthodox. So that partisanship, it's hard to know how this is going to sort of play out overall within the community of more observant Jews. I do think there's something else at play, which I suspect happened in the Trump era that Biden will be attuned to trying to dial back a little bit, which is that I think more than any other time really in our lifetimes, right, support for Israel became very polarized and partisan in Washington in the Trump era. And it became, Democrats, whereas it was once sort of like just assume that Democrats stood with Israel, it became a little more difficult for some of them to take that position. And it just became polarized in this way that people in the Jewish community who work on Israel issues on both sides of the aisle told me that they worried was really dangerous for Israel because administrations, of course, changed. Parties in power, of course, changed. Perhaps the best thing for Israel in the US is to have really strong bipartisan support. And I do think that Biden is attuned to that development. And you get the sense that that's something he'll try to tamp down a little bit and bring support for Israel back to more of a bipartisan consensus. I also think the model for how he approaches Israel will be more like Clinton than Obama, even though he was Obama's vice president. He comes out of sort of that school. He obviously is, very familiar with the Holocaust and the legacy of the Holocaust. He talks about meeting Golda Meir. Like, I think his views are different than perhaps the president he served under. So that will be a little bit perhaps of a realignment, and how that dovetails with sort of the rising liberal wing of his party will be really interesting to watch. And then it'll also be interesting to see what Netanyahu does, because of course he faces his own difficult political dynamics in Israel with the economy, with COVID. And he's really, in some ways, made his relationship with Trump a central part of his recent political brand. So how he pivots will be an interesting dynamic to keep an eye on as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Of course, this is something I wanted to get to because everyone wants to know what the U.S.-Israel relationship is going to be like under the new administration. I think this relationship that President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu have had has been a pretty rosy one, at least from public view. I mean, a lot of symbiosis on important issues. But you're pointing out that Joe Biden comes from a slightly different political tradition than President Obama did. So we're not going to expect necessarily an Obama 2.0 with respect to the Middle East. Is that?
And I think you're right that they have had a close relationship, right? And that's been able to accomplish some things that were on people's wish list for Israel. Yeah. But you do have to wonder, and I think there are many people who wonder about the long-term consequences of injecting such fierce partisan politics into this relationship. Like, the reality is the vast majority of the Jewish community are Democrats, and they are a fair number of them are liberal Democrats. And to make it harder for those Jews to support Israel because it's becoming so tied to Trump, you have to wonder if that is a good thing for support for Israel in the long term? And I think there are people asking those questions, and I think that's a dynamic that Biden will is coming to office aware of, and the people around Biden who are very experienced with foreign policy are also coming into office aware of. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with issues like settlements, with a two-state solution, all these things that have not been hot. Really, Trump has been sort of fine with settlements. I don't think that's the position that a Biden administration will take, but I also think Biden has his hands full at home right now, as do Netanyahu. So we'll just have to see how much these issues really rise to the front of anyone's political agenda right now.
Yeah, actually, it's an important point, because one thing that President Trump did do was declare that the U.S. no longer views settlements in the West Bank as illegal. And so for President Biden to reverse that decision would, be significant. It certainly would. It would be an announcement that would reverberate. I would put it that way. Josh, what are your thoughts about the direction of the U.S.-Israel relationship under a new administration?
Yeah, I think Lisa's points were spot on, and I'll just add two really quick things. Number one, personnel is policy. So a lot of times you don't necessarily trust the principal, but you got to look at their top advisors. And without going into all, we don't know who's going to be SecDef, SecState, National Security Advisor. But if you look at the top advisors that really Biden feels comfortable with, these are folks with deep familiarity with Netanyahu, with the pro-Israel community. And if you look at the folks that were kind of had Obama's ear, they were not folks, in certain cases at least. But Ben Rhodes probably comes to mind most prominently. But there are a lot of other folks who were shaping national security that reflected Obama's views that were a little heterodox at the time. And these are not national security folks that are likely going to have a spot in a future Biden administration. And I think Lisa's point was really important about just the broader politics of Israel policy. If you look at the polling, yes, there's younger liberal Democrats have shown less support for Israel, and Republicans have pretty much solidified behind support for Israel in the last 4 years. But the overall top lines of support for Israel have been pretty constant when you look at every single significant reputable poll. We're talking like 2/3 of Americans have a strong view, a supportive view of the U.S.-Israel relationship. So the notion that like a Biden administration would come in trying to pick a fight on that front doesn't make a lot of political sense, just from a pure looking at the electoral consequences point of view. That is not something. I mean, that the Jewish vote is a big part, as Lisa said, of the Democratic base, and there are liberal Zionists, there are liberal voters that were uncomfortable with some of Obama's positions on the Middle East, even if they ended up voting for him. So I don't think that Biden's going to want to pick a fight in the family. That would be very divisive, as we've seen over time in the last 4 years between the left and the moderates of the party on Israel.
Yeah, well, of course, you're pointing to something else which is significant, which is the generational shift that we may be seeing occur, because, as opposed to just the alignment of political personalities, Trump and Netanyahu getting along and so forth, and then Biden now forging his own relationship as president with the Israelis. But the fact that we're losing, for example, some very stalwart pro-Israel members of Congress like Eliot Engel and Nita Lowey and Joe Crowley lost a primary to Ocasio-Cortez. These are longtime pro-Israel members of Congress, and they're being replaced by younger people who may not share the same views. So this also very much impacts the equation. I want to ask you about another important concern of ours, which is combating anti-Semitism and anti-Israel hatred. And of course, this should always be a bipartisan value, no question about it. But sometimes it seems like Democrats have an easier time spotting anti-Semitism on the far right, and Republicans have an easier time spotting it on the far left or among Islamist extremists. And as we said, President-elect Biden will have to deal with the progressive wing of his party. And this includes someone like Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who actually has engaged in anti-Semitism by propagating stereotypes about money and power and demonizing Israel as recently as this month with accusations of ethnic cleansing. It also includes people who are not anti-Semitic, but whose support for BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and in conditioning U.S. aid to Israel based on Israeli politics, are deeply problematic for the bilateral relationship. So, aside from taking a different stance from these people that, as President Biden may very well do on some key issues, how forthright do you think he will be as president in reining in these elements of his own party, calling out moments when their criticism of Israeli policy crosses the line, for example, and other excesses of anti-Israel hatred?
I think there are two encouraging signs in our broader politics that suggest things may be changing for the better, without speaking to Biden specifically at first. I mean, number one, anti-Semitism thrives when extremism, when folks are kind of playing to each other's extremes and bases. And we saw that, that was a big concern, obviously, in the Trump era, where he would kind of, overtly signal to supporters of his that were anti-Semitic or, having these awful stereotypes. And even if he didn't say it, even if people in his administration weren't saying it, he was sort of giving succor to some of these extremes. And the same thing on the left, that Pelosi really had a hard time even getting a resolution condemning Omar's anti-Semitism through her own caucus because of objections from elements of her progressive caucus. I think the fact that you have a more moderate, more pragmatic voice at the top should, and it's not going to change overnight, but should at least tamp down some of the extremes. Again, you can't put everything back in a bottle right away, but I think that the trend is an encouraging one. It's certainly more encouraging than if Democrats nominated someone who was much more progressive, much more from the activist wing of their own party. And you're asking about Biden. The question is, how much political courage is he able to muster if you do have another issue? You mentioned the Omar, it's all about the Benjamins tweet. There are a small number of folks in their caucus that are hard to restrain, and they're probably going to say things like that. And I think it'll be a good early test for a Biden administration whether he is willing to spend that political capital to condemn those types of comments. I will say, just from a larger political point, in these tribal times and these partisan times, it doesn't matter if someone's on the left is attacking Trump or Trump is attacking someone on the left, or Republicans are attacking Democrats or Democrats are attacking Republicans. The biggest movement in fighting this kind of hatred and anti-Semitism is when someone in your own party speaks out against someone else in your own party that's not behaving in a responsible way. And that has been lacking in these last 4 years. There's reason for hope, but as the quote from Ronald Reagan says, trust but verify. I think we're going to be doing a lot of verifying to see where our body politic is these next few years as we change administrations and change styles of governance.
Lisa, what do you think? Anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment on the outer flanks of our parties. Will we be seeing this, voice of responsibility from President Biden and others and calling it out?
I think when we have this conversation, we focus heavily sometimes on BDS, and we seem to forget that there were these two horrific shootings at synagogues and all kinds of threats, and that we know violence against, hate crimes against Jews has gone up to record levels during the Trump administration. And on that front, which is like real, concern and threat that is happening now in our communities, which, I can say as someone who has kids in day school, I worry about a lot more than I think I should have to worry about. I think that's an area where President Trump turned a blind eye, that he was unwilling to denounce some elements that are a part of his base in terms of domestic extremism. And on that front, I think we'll see a different tone from the Biden administration. I think in terms of domestic extremism, we'll see Biden take a much stronger position than we saw from the president. I think we'll see more money in the State Department put towards combating anti-Semitism at home. And then which I think is really, I have to say, that is something important. If you, are someone who is going through Jewish institutions and is participating in the Jewish community right now. I mean, when you look at those numbers, of hate crimes, those threats are real and they have gone up. As for the issue of BDS and anti-Israel rhetoric on the left, I suspect we will see Biden more willing to denounce those kinds of comments. The question, as Josh points out, will be how forcefully will he denounce the people in his own caucus making them, and that I don't think we know, but. I do think Biden, as I said before, comes out of this older school of democratic position on Israel, more of the Clinton school, where they see Israel as a key part of, the relationship with Israel as a key part of, American foreign policy. And I suspect he will denounce those comments. The question is, how forcefully he denounces the people making them. And we'll just have to see how the politics play out. But as Josh points out, I think that will be a real test if that happens for the Biden administration, particularly if it happens in the first, 6 months or a year.
Yeah, well, you make an important point. Anti-Semitism as it occurs either on the far left or the far right, or from the radical extremists in the Muslim community. I think these are all, you can't isolate or you can't ignore any of these sources of anti-Semitic hatred, and we need to pay attention to all of them. And of course, I think one thing the three of us have in common is we're all parents, and I know Josh and I have kids in the same age cohort at our synagogue, and when we come back from the virus, I expect there will still be police cars parked outside the synagogue, and we worry about dropping our kids off there on a Sunday morning. So this is something that affects all of us in a very personal way, and so we can't rest on these concerns. We're nearing the end of our time, and I know, Lisa, you've got to leave very soon, but I want to turn to my colleague, Oren Drury, from our UN Affairs Office in New York, and he's been monitoring our Q&A screen, and he's going to let us know if we've got any questions from the audience. Oren.
Yes, hi, thank you, Eric, and thank you, Lisa and Josh. We have a question from Rob Spitzer about the possibility that groups like the Problem Solver Caucus and other moderate groups can help make Congress work to address national challenges now, especially since some of the more moderate Democrats, people like Max Rose, who lost, and others who had very close elections, surprisingly close elections, had to went through that in this election cycle. So what can we look from that caucus and others like it?
Well, I'll say that the Problem Solvers Caucus, a bunch of moderates. It's a good mission. They certainly try to move things in a more bipartisan direction. I think they will have less influence in the upcoming Congress. The Senate, I think, is the legislative body that's more ripe for strategic bipartisanship. The House could be a total anarchy because if Pelosi has a narrow majority, it's going to be the progressives that are probably going to be more likely to blow things up, use that leverage to prevent maybe more bipartisan, more moderate legislation from getting through. The one thing about moderates, the one thing about problem solvers is they don't usually like to blow things up. They don't usually like to create chaos, even if it's in the service of their best interests. So I think if there is a lot of problems, challenges in the upcoming Congress, that Pelosi has one of the narrowest majorities for a Democratic leader in many decades. It's likely going to be 7 or 8 votes. She can't afford to lose more than that. So, it's nice. It's all nice and good what the Problem Solvers Caucus is doing, though I don't know if they're going to have quite as much political leverage, and they didn't have a whole lot in this past Congress either.
Lisa.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, sort of on a broader level, like we live in a fiercely polarized time, and we just went through 4 years of very, very polarized politics. So the question is whether, and that's not Joe Biden. As I said, he comes from this earlier school, reaching across the aisle, crafting bipartisan legislation. Like, that's not something we've seen in Washington for a long time. Like, really, since before the Obama administration, right? I suppose there were a few fiscal deals during the Obama administration, but generally, like, we are in this polarized moment. And the question is whether, this bipartisan, maybe more moderate approach that Joe Biden, the school that he comes from, that traditional Washington school, can survive and thrive and get things done in the current political environment. And, that's, I think, will be the real test of his first year in office. And I think that's what we'll be watching, is whether there is still room for people like the Problem Solver Caucus, or, if we're just living in this country that's growing more and more divided.
Yeah, I will. If I can revise and extend my remarks really quickly.
Please do.
I will say that, like, the one thing, and Lisa points to Biden and the broader politics matter, but presidents have a bully pulpit. They have a lot of power. So if Biden wanted to bless, a lot of this comes down to where Biden sees things. And, the president, Obama had a whole lot of power. He could, you would look at a lot of major legislative items that may not have been easy to pass, but when he got his party behind him and he used the bully pulpit, he at least was able to get his party together and push some things forward. So I think a lot of it comes down to how effective Biden will be and how strategic he ends up being. Because if he wants to bless if he wants to kind of, really bless the Problem Solvers Caucus and adopt their agenda items, that could make a big difference.
Yeah, Josh is right. The one thing I will say is that I think what we've seen in the election on the Democratic side is not necessarily indicative of what we're going to see going forward, right? Like, the progressives, the liberal wing of that party, really made a very conscious decision Biden was never their guy. And they made a very conscious decision to hold their fire because, as Bernie Sanders said it himself, for those of you who watched the convention, that they saw Democrats across all ideological stripes saw Trump as such an existential threat to the country and really to democracy that they were willing to, like, keep all their intra-party fights in. That truce, as soon as Biden takes office, that truce is over. It's already ending, from the people that Josh and I talked to. And the question will be, like, how ready, the liberal wing of that party is to go to war with Biden. I think with an election like this, normally with elections, you get a sense of where a party is going, like which part of the party has come out dominant in the sort of the future of the party. And we really didn't get that either side this time. And in the Democratic Party, both the moderates and the liberals are claiming that they have a mandate for their agenda. And I think the liberals see, the virus is really a chance to get these broader structural changes that they would like to see happen, like, a public option or free college. And the moderates, I think, worry about that approach and whether it'll make it impossible for them to win back the kind of white working class voters they lost to Trump. So this is very unsettled in the Democratic Party. And we'll have to see how willing the party is to find consensus within itself and rally behind whatever Biden's agenda may be.
Excellent. Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our appointed time, although we could spend hours learning from you about your take on recent events. But Lisa and Josh, you've both been tremendous. I think we're a much more educated and better informed community as a result of having had this discussion with you. So we're going to continue to look for you and listen to what you have to say. And thank you for spending this time with us this afternoon. We appreciate it.